So welcome to the fourth lecture of corporate finance for the MSc Finance. So this lecture will be about monitoring, particularly about active and passive monitoring. So we'll see in a bit what that means. But you can imagine that monitor is going to be somebody who's going to be monitor the activities of the entrepreneur. So it's basically somebody going to reduce the moral hazard that's inherent in the effort choices, the hidden effort choices that the entrepreneur is going to make. So we've looked at agency problems, starting with moral hazard, so the hidden action model that we looked at in the first two lectures. And then last lecture we had a look at adverse selection, so hidden information. And we saw that in either case, these agency problems, so these informational problems, cause inefficiencies in the contracts. So what kind of inefficiencies did we have? Well, in particular, we saw that some projects might not be financed even though they are positive NPV, so that was called credit rationing. And last week we also saw that sometimes the agents might engage in behavior, signaling behavior, that is rational from their point of view, but which reduces essentially the total welfare of this or the efficiency of these projects. So for instance, we saw these debt collateral signaling systems which created a device which improved the outcome for the entrepreneur, which from a total welfare point of view was inefficient. Okay, so this week we go back to the moral hazard problem, and we ask whether we can reduce the information asymmetry, so the moral hazard problem, the hidden action problem, by having somebody else monitoring the behavior of the entrepreneur. So we'll make a distinction between two kinds of monitoring. So one is active monitoring, and active monitoring basically means that ex ante, which means before the project is carried out, there is already an intervention in what the management can do by somebody who has some information, perhaps not all information, but some information, so can improve upon the effort choices, or upon the flexibility that's left to the entrepreneur, which creates this hidden action problem. So that person is the active monitor. A passive monitor would not intervene ex ante, but rather look at ex post or perhaps ex interim what the outcomes of the actions of the manager are, of the entrepreneur are, and use that outcome or perhaps some intermediate outcome to have to intervene actually in the performance bonus, if you wish, the remuneration compensation of the manager. So looking at this figure here, we see the first row is the ex ante monitoring, so the active monitoring consists of intervention in management. So what happens if you intervene in management, then you reduce the scope for suboptimal, from an investor point of view, management actions, with the hope of improving corporate performance. If, on the other hand, you're exposed monitoring, so you take a picture of the firm exposed, so after the effort choices of the management have been made, you look what the effect of those actions of the manager were, and you implement some compensation scheme depending on the outcome that you can see, that the information that you gather as an exposed monitor. So this consists of rewards and punishments, basically. So who does this? So for instance, an ex ante or an active monitor might be a bank or a large shareholder or even a venture capitalist who basically sits in the boardroom, at least sometimes, who intervenes, who perhaps has to approve of certain investments ex ante. The exposed passive monitor would look at what happens with the firm, and they might intervene based on what do they see in terms of market prices, but they might actually make trades based on what they see which affect market prices. They might intervene in terms of remunerating management based on the credit rating that's obtained from some external credit rater. So it will be exposed or passive monitoring. So passive monitoring takes the exposed perspective. Active monitoring takes the ex-ante perspective. This picture of passive versus active monitoring is closely related, though not quite the same as what some call the clash of civilizations, or perhaps more in more subdued terms, the Anglo-Saxon versus the Rhineland models. So the Anglo-Saxon model is the model predominant perhaps in the US and also in the UK, and to some extent also in the Netherlands, which relies to a large extent on passive monitoring or market monitoring. So market players look at what is this, what can we actually see from the outcomes of the actions of the firms, and based on what we see, we might want to take actions, as in selling off our stocks or changing payments to the management. So active monitoring is sort of more closely related to the Rhineland model, where concentrated shareholders, rather than dispersed shareholders that you might see more in the US, would intervene ex ante by sitting with the executive board. Also, the banks might be on the non-executive part of the board to discuss firm strategy and firm investments, for instance, ex ante with the managers, so as to hopefully prevent them from taking actions which are not in the interests of the shareholders or the creditors. So another component which is slightly different actually from this active versus passive monitoring distinction to these two kinds of models, the Anglo-Saxon versus the Rhineland model, is what's the identity actually of this monitor. So in particular in the Rhineland model, we often see incumbent monitors, so monitors who are already deeply involved in this firm as a major investor, for instance, or as a bank. So the house bank in the German model would be a typical example here of one of these incumbent monitors in the Rhineland model of financing. On the other hand, in these Anglo-Saxon models, monitoring falls more to outside monitors, so monitors who are not actively engaged by the management of the firm, but who themselves rise up to this occasion and who use performance indication of the information of this firm for their own speculative purposes. So you can think here of shareholders who take actions in terms of selling off or buying large positions or short selling positions in this firm. Corporate traders who might intervene in by buying a large proportion, often against the at least sometimes against the desires of management, hedge funds, who make their voice heard through the press often, but also to the boards of directors and managers directly. And those might be both active or passive. So these hedge funds can take a very active role, obviously, if they really want to change the strategy, which is an ex-ante measure of the firm. So this is another component that's related to, but not identical to, the active versus passive monitoring discussion. So what we'll go and do now first is have a look at the model of active monitoring. And for this model, we go back to the fixed investment model. So the model with effort choice by the entrepreneur for this project, which involves his initial investment I, and again the entrepreneur can choose an action either to put in some effort into the project or not put in effort but get some private benefits, which we again call capital B. And if there is an effort choice, then this affects the probability of success in an advantageous way, so it becomes high, pH, whereas still there might be some probability of failure, which will be, of course, be 1 minus pH. Whereas if this entrepreneur does not take the effort, the probability of success will be low, PL, and there's of course a larger 1 minus PL probability of failure in the no effort mode of operations. So that was the fixed investment model that we studied already in the initial part of this course. We wrote this, or we looked at this from a principal agent model point of view, where remember the investor was the principal who's investing the money, IL, or perhaps IL minus, the lender share basically in the investment, so which typically was I minus A in that context, and in return got this remuneration RL, the lender's share of the outcome in case of success. And the agent might have invested their own assets, which we called A, but also in return, of course, got this RB, the share in the total outcome R again, if the project was successful. So we're going to look again at this principal agent model, but now with an additional player. So the additional player is going to be the monitor, or perhaps the supervisor. So what this monitor is going to do is, this monitor is going to be enlisted to reduce moral hazard. So at some cost, so the monitor has to incur some costs to co-manage the project. So if this monitor gets on board, is enlisted perhaps, the monitor can take an action at a cost C, which is going to, you might interpret this as gathering some information on the different strategies that are available to the firm. And if the monitor does this, then some of the more egregious modes of no effort, of private benefits for the entrepreneur are going to be closed off. So the presence and the activities of this monitor guarantee that the entrepreneur cannot actually get these private benefits capital B anymore, but still there might be some degree of flexibility and some choice which leaves a slighter amount, which we call little b, for the as private benefits for the entrepreneur, which are then associated with the low effort choice. And still, of course, the entrepreneur still has the high effort choice, which gives them no private benefits at all. So the monitor makes sure that basically the private benefits available to the entrepreneur get reduced from this capital B to this lowercase b. So that you can imagine this makes it easier to solve basically the incentive problems for the entrepreneur. By taking this action, of course, also this monitor incurs a cost, so presumably this monitor also gets some revenues, and the monitor is hired by the firm. So these rewards for the monitor will be paid out in the form again of a reward RM, where M stands for monitor, if the project succeeds, because if it doesn't, there is no money basically. And we'll also assume that this monitor might also be a co-investor. So we can ask the monitor might be a bank, for instance, who sits has a position, has a seat on the board of the non-executive board of this company, and they may actually co-invest into this company an amount IM, monitor's investment share. So in terms of this principal agent model, what do we have? So we still have the outside investors. So the monitor doesn't take up all investment requirements. So there's still the principal who is the outside investor who has no information, who's going to invest IL, the lender's share again in these investment funds, and will get a share RL in the positive outcome if there is success. And the investor knows there is this monitor who has a contract which awards this monitor RM in case of success, and also knows that the monitor is going to contribute a share IM of investment towards financing this business. And the monitor is known to be incurring a cost C if they do their work seriously. So the entrepreneur then finally, of course, is in the agent. The entrepreneur has rights RB to the outcome of the project and is going to invest their own share A, their assets, into the project. So now the new part here, so of course these the investor and the entrepreneur still need their participation constraint and their incentive compatibility constraint, but now also this monitor is going to take some action. We're going to assume that also the monitor's action are not observable to the outsiders. So the outsiders need to be aware that these monitors will have some incentive to work. So they need to be confident that the monitor is actually going to perform the monitoring duties. So it's going to expend the money, the cost C, to figure out which are the more detrimental strategies that we want to close off and which will be the better strategies that we will leave open to the entrepreneur. And we'll also have a participation constraint for the monitor, because this monitor is not going to work for less than zero. It's not going to want to incur a loss. So again, we'll assume initially at least that the monitor needs to break even. So there might be many monitors, so many banks who might be eligible for financing, but they do want to break even. They don't want to make a loss on their investments. So what this means is we will again have to sort of deal with various constraints. So if the entrepreneur's constraints, and the lender's constraint, investor's constraints, but we will now also have the monitor's constraints. So what I'll do is they are here on the slide for the entrepreneur already, but I'll go to the paper so as to write down these various constraints that we have now for the various players in this game. So here we are on paper. So we start again with the borrower. So who is the entrepreneur? So again, borrower, the entrepreneur has their incentive constraint. Incentive compatibility reads, well, if I do the effort, PH will be the probability of success, and then I get my RB. And I want this to be bigger than or equal to what I get if I choose not to do the effort, in which case I get RB, but still with the lower probability PL than the no effort probability. And because in this equilibrium that we are looking at, this monitor is going to spend effort to close off the more egregious routes of the high private benefits, I can only get the low effort project with low private benefits. So my private benefits, due to the presence and activities of this monitor, will be little b. So obviously you have seen this equation before with a capital B, but it makes no difference in terms of solving it. This reduces to the RB needs to be big enough, so the entrepreneur needs to have a big enough share to make sure that's going to be profitable to work. So it's going to be bigger than little b divided over delta p. So now let's look at the monitor next. So the monitor needs an incentive to work as well. So they need the incentive to incur these costs to figure out which projects are the more beneficial ones, to close off this capital B route to the entrepreneur. And if they do that, they will be assured, because they also know that the incentive compatibility condition will hold in the equilibrium that we'll look at, that the entrepreneur, that the borrower is going to do the effort. So if they do their work, then the entrepreneur is going to do the effort on the firm. So the probability of success is going to be PH, and the remuneration that the monitor gets is called RM. So that's what the monitor gets in expectation if they do the work, but there's a cost to doing work, and the cost to doing work, to gathering this information is what's called C. So this is the payoff if they do that information gathering and make sure that the borrower will then have every incentive to do the high effort work. If they do not do this work, on the other hand, they do not close off this route for the borrower to take the high private benefits, the capital B project, in which case the borrower is not going to work on the project. So it's only a low probability of success. So the monitor is going to take into account a low probability of success of getting my RM, but I do not, as a monitor, incur these costs C. Okay, so that's the monitor's incentive compatibility condition. Then next step is the monitor also wants to at least break even. So the participation constraint for the monitor is the next bit, the next constraint that we will want to have satisfied. So what's the monitor's gain in this equilibrium? pH times Rm. And it needs to be at least as large as the amount of money, amount of investment that the monitor is going to contribute into this project, plus of course this cost that the monitor is going to incur in terms of gathering the information and blocking this high private benefits project. So this is the participation constraint for the monitor. And finally, we have the lenders, the outside lenders, who are essentially passively sitting by. They put in the money, and they want to be assured, of course, that that both the borrower, the entrepreneur, and the monitor are going to put in the work, and they will get RL, or in other words, they will get the remainder R minus RB minus RM. So the shares which are not promised to the borrower or to the monitor, they will be RL. Essentially, they will go to the outside lenders, and this has to be at least as large as, in order for these people to want to participate, as large as the funds that they have to contribute, which is the total funds required for the project minus the funds that are contributed out of the assets of the entrepreneur A minus the part that is financed by the monitor IM. So we have 4 constraints now. So we already had previously this incentive compatibility constraint, and now it's sort of replaced with a little b counterpart because of this monitoring activity. We also had before the participation constraint for the lenders, although it now also has to be sort of to this has to be added the parts that go to the monitor and the part that's financed by the monitor. And the new parts, of course, are the incentive compatibility constraint for the monitor. So the RM share has to be high enough for the monitor to take this costly information gathering action, and the RM has to be high enough to make sure that, in view of the contributions that the monitor makes, so which is both a contribution in terms of financing and a contribution in terms of their own efforts, cost of effort C of gathering the information, they do not make a loss. So let's solve this bit. So again, solving from the point of view of maximizing the borrower's utility. So we're going to assume actually that these monitors, that there's plenty of monitors as well. So we're going to assume a lot of competition among monitors who have a lot of money as well, so that we can ask them to contribute funds IM to what we wish, to the extent that we wish, basically themselves. So what we shall do basically is we'll make sure that the monitors get a remuneration RM which is going to be high enough for them to have the incentive to do the monitoring. So the monitor, we solve this. The monitor needs to get an RM from the incentive compatibility constraint, which is going to be at least as high as C over delta P by similar computations as that we did for the entrepreneur. What IM can we ask these people to contribute? Well, there's an abundance of monitors with lots of capital, or enough capital at least. So these banks have some capital of their own to actually co-invest in this project. So they're going to make sure that the monitors are actually going to break even. They don't need to make a rent. They're going to break even just like the outside lenders are breaking even. So what does it mean? It means that pH RM is just enough, going to be enough, sorry, it's going to be equal actually to the investment plus the additional monitoring costs that these monitors incur. So IM essentially is pH times this RM. So we can make it just enough actually, because that's enough for them to earn their share, to make sure that they spend the monitoring effort. So pH RM will determine then in turn what is the amount of additional money IM of funding that we can ask from these monitors without them actually making a loss. So now that we know RM and we know IM, we can actually plug that into the participation constraint for the lenders, which then simplifies to, of course, pH times R minus RB. Let me first write it like this. So participation constraint for the lenders leads to, I didn't do anything, I just wrote the brackets a little bit differently. It's going to be bigger than or equal to I minus A minus IM. And I'm going to use the fact that pH RM will be just enough for these monitors to break even. So what does that mean? pH times R minus RB minus, now I plug in IM plus C is bigger than I minus A minus IM. And you see this IM actually now conveniently dropping out here, but we have this new contribution. So minus IM on this side, minus IM on the right hand side as well. The new part here is this minus C. So in the end, this participation constraint reduces to pH times R minus RB. It's going to be bigger than or equal to I minus A plus this C, which appeared here on the left hand side with the minus sign. So this is the new participation constraint. You also have the incentive constraint for the manager, for the borrower, for the entrepreneur, which RB needs to be bigger or equal to this little b over delta P. So we can now actually use this to rewrite the pledgeable income condition or participation constraint in terms of the when we can satisfy this, which is going to be, well, pH times R minus the minimum RB that we can have, which is this bit. That needs to be bigger or equal to I minus A plus C as a necessary condition. Now from this, so this is the necessary condition to finance this project essentially. So you see again, if A is too small, we might not be able to satisfy this condition, because if A is small, then the right hand side here becomes bigger, and it might actually grow beyond the left hand side that we have over here. And then we again would have credit rationing. So let's write down what the threshold value is. So the A bar value, if you wish, in this case, A needs to be bigger than pH times R minus little b over delta P minus I minus C. This thing is the new A bar width monitor, if you wish. So we want to compare this, of course, with what we had in the no monitoring case. In the no monitoring case, we had A bar, so the threshold assets that were necessary to avoid credit rationing, they were equal to pH times R minus the big B over delta P minus I. So you see two changes. So one change is capital B has been reduced to little b. That's positive in the sense that makes it easier to meet the requirement, so that that reduces the A bar monitoring. So the fact that B has decreased makes this threshold easier to meet. On the other hand, we also have the C, which comes in now and which is going to reduce A bar. So that's bad from a point of view of credit rationing. This makes it more difficult to finance these projects. So we're going to assume, of course, monitoring, let's put it different, monitoring is only going to make sense if the benefits of monitoring, which is reducing these private benefits, or the size of moral hazard, if you wish, from capital B to little b, outweighs the actual costs of monitoring, which is this little c. So let's go back to the slides where these same computations are done as well. So here we are. So we looked at the entrepreneur's constraint. So again, we had this incentive compatibility constraint for the monitor. And we're going to assume, basically, I didn't mention this explicitly just now, perhaps, but we're going to assume that this RB, or the RB that we can pay, is not sufficient to warrant incentive compatibility in case the outside benefits are still, the private benefits are still as large as capital B. Because if they were, then we would have no problem at all. It would have not been a necessity of bringing in this monitor. So we assume that this capital B is so high that we can never actually meet this, solve the problems without monitoring. So this was the entrepreneur, reducing capital B to little b. Then we looked at the monitor's incentive compatibility constraint. So we first had the incentive compatibility constraint just made sure that the monitor needs to expend the effort or the costs of gathering this information, cost C, and that means the share RM that they get out of the success of this project needs to be large enough. And on the other hand, we can ask this this monitor to also contribute some IM, but they need to break even at least. So the cost that the monitor is incurring, which is a total IM plus the cost of monitoring itself, C, needs to be met, needs to be at least needs to be lower than what they get, what they expect to get PHRM out of the project. So the investor, finally, the outside investor, had a participation constraint which takes into account that parts of the outcome share go to both the borrower and to the monitor, and also the part of the project is actually financed by both these other players in the game. So we had these 4 different constraints, and we looked at solving this model by making sure that these that the monitor actually has sufficient income to make sure that they have the incentive to do the monitoring, but also that they contributed so much to the project that they get no additional rents. That was not necessary because of competition among the various monitors. So we plugged that into the participation constraint for the outsiders, and in the end we used that to figure out, what's the minimum A bar, so A bar M, I just called it on paper, in this case of monitoring that the entrepreneur needs to get the project done, to get this project financed and monitored. And we compare this with the situation without monitoring, which, as long as this capital B is much higher than the little b, which let's just make sure that that happens here, then the case without monitoring, the entrepreneur might be credit rationed because they do not have sufficient funds, whereas with monitoring, this project might be financed. So the question is, in general, when should we have monitoring? So first of all, we will only have monitoring if it indeed actually reduces A bar, so the difference in this, going from this big B to the little b, should outweigh the disadvantage of these monitoring costs. But we also know that, if the project is financed, then there is some inefficiency in the sense that without monitoring, we wouldn't have this additional cost. So this cost of monitoring C is an inefficiency that we might need to have in order to get this project running in the first place. So if that's the case, or we have to incur this, we have this costly monitor, And that's going to reduce total outcome, total NPV that's available to the players. Well, in this case of perfect competition, what's available to the players goes again to the entrepreneurs because all the other players are competing. So only firms with insufficient capital will actually choose to have monitoring. So if you have sufficient capital and you can actually get your project financed without monitoring, you do not have to incur this inefficiency, these additional costs C of monitoring. But if you can't without monitoring, but you can get your project financed with monitoring, well, then you might be happy to actually get at least some rents, some PHR minus I minus C, rather than no rents because your project is completely rationed. So I looked at the case in which there was no contribution to investment, so IM was equal to 0. So we looked at the case in which IM was not equal to 0, so the monitor had cash. So let's now also look at the case in which there's just a single monitor, or there might be many monitors, but they just don't have any capital to invest into this project. Does that mean that we cannot give them any stakes or any rents from this project? No, of course not. I mean, they need to get this RM because otherwise they will not do their monitoring. So we have to award them this rent RM equal, well, at least to C over delta P, because otherwise they will not do their tasks, they will not carry out their monitoring activities. So what that means, if they do get a payoff, but they don't incur these investment costs, they only occur the monitoring costs. And if you do the math, you see they get at least some rent, which is going to the monitor. So what that means is there's going to be a little bit less rents to be distributed among the lenders and the borrowers, so that it will turn out that some of the pledgeable income is actually going to decrease. Pledgeable income is going to go down as a result of the fact that these monitors will not contribute if they have no cash. So as a final comment on active monitoring, so who is this active monitor? Well, it could be an exogenously designated, chosen monitor. So somebody who gets a contract with this firm, say a bank who is rewarded in terms of higher rewards on the outcome, so higher interest rate essentially. It could be a venture capitalist who's being rewarded by getting some additional shares, some additional stock in this company. It could be a private placement with a large shareholder who's going to have an incentive because of his large shareholdings to do essentially some monitoring. It could also be an endogenous monitor who is not explicitly paid for monitoring, but will buy up a large share in the total stock holdings of this firm as an outsider, just on the stock market. It could be a trader, for instance, who buys a large share in the stocks of the company, and as a result has indeed the incentive to do some of this monitoring work, but they also have to get paid for their costs somehow. And here we see there might be a free rider problem. So everybody would like there to be some monitor, somebody is going to take care of these costs. But if there's many large shareholders on board, they will be looking at each other. They will each do perhaps some of the monitoring, but there is a serious concern that there might be some under monitoring as a result of the fact that other people are going to benefit from your monitoring activities, which are costly to you. So you make the cost, other people benefit as well, which is a free rider problem. So that was active monitoring, so the ex-ante monitoring, so the ex-ante reducing of the scope of moral hazard that's available to that's open for the entrepreneur. So the next section will be on passive monitoring. So see the next video for that.